Back. This is my TriTime presentation part 2. So I recently spoke about some of the regrets and the challenges I had during my TriTime experience, and now I'm going to speak of the stuff I did about it. So I ended up actually asking for help, which is one of the things I spoke of earlier with misunderstanding. I raised my hand and I asked every single teacher in the room, and I wrote down what they had to say to me, which you'll see here on a picture at the top right, I think it will be. On a notebook, you'll be able to read it right there. Those were some of the notes I took, and I created a to-do list. Now, Mr. Buxton spoke about a to-do list at the very start of the TriTime experience, and so I started one the very day he said it because I thought it'd be great for my productivity, and it really has worked. I started filling them out based on what I had to do at the end of the class, and then at the end of class, I filled out the stuff I had already done. I didn't include a picture of it right here. I'll include a picture of it on the next slide, but I created a table that had all the titles of my cards, and I wrote down all the content I had for them, like, for example, some of the reflections I had, and some of the ideas that I had, and you'll see that on my next slide. I included this in this presentation. And I moved from distraction. Now you'll hear me talk about this a lot before in my reflections. I was struggling with distraction, I was struggling with talking to my friends, and so I made up my mind to move myself. And so I finally did. Oh, also here, I've written down, I moved from incorrect research. Now this is one of the things I found that was quite interesting. I ended up doing research, and I was doing research, but as I mentioned before, I was doing it blindly. I didn't have a goal, and so therefore a lot of my research was quite bad because I didn't know what to research, and I didn't exactly know why. And so I ended up trying to ask for advice on some of my leads and finding some corresponding research questions, which I spoke of earlier in my presentation. So here's some of the things I did with creativity. So I was quite proud of myself for. Now, I cannot take full credit for this because later Mr. Buxton actually told the class to do this. I didn't know he was going to tell us to do it, but I was quite proud of myself. I finally decided to take charge of how I spent my time, and so I created a table to help my productivity of all the slides, of like what all the slides would be. I included links for pictures, and I included notes that I mentioned during my presentation. And I was really quite proud of that. I believe I started on this on week 2 of the 3-week-long TriTime presentation period. Alright, some of the unintentional learning that I figured out about myself during this long process was that I need a goal. I need a goal because without a goal, I don't know how to make the journey right. For me, I'm a perfectionist, and if I don't have all the correct steps, I'm always upset when the final project doesn't end out correctly. And so if I don't have a goal, if I don't have an exact list of things that I need to have done in specific time periods, as I mentioned before when I created my table, I won't be doing that well. And that's one of the things I definitely learned about myself early in time that I'll remember for future projects. I need a goal, and I need to ask for it, not just make assumptions about it. This is one thing I'm a little shy to speak of, is that I need to not sit by my friends. I have a tendency to sit with people because it makes me feel happy, and I like to be in other people's, company, but it's not really that good for my productivity. I work best when I'm alone, and perhaps I shouldn't say this because I might be cut off from my friends, but it's the reality, and it's hard for me to face, but I'm glad that I admit it. So this is one thing I spoke about in my part 1 of my presentation. If I ask too many questions, I'll get it mixed up. I'll have too many approaches on one thing. This was one of the things I struggled with when creating my DQ. Was I asked all the teachers. I asked Miss Levine, I asked Mr. Livingstone, I asked a different sub, I'm not quite sure what her name was, and I asked Mr. Buxton. And they all gave me great advice, but it was all different approaches, and when we have too many approaches weaved into one project, then it doesn't end up good. We have too many ways of figuring it out. And what I found for myself was when I finally just took charge and said, I can figure this out on my own, thanks for the advice, that's when my DQ became best. I think I might have mentioned this in my first part, but here's a quote I wrote down for myself. And this is what I live by day during the TriTime experience. It's better to ask, and be a pest rather than pretend you know and make it worse for yourself. So this was definitely meaningful for me because I often just try to convince myself, as I said before, I'm a perfectionist. I don't want help. I convince myself I can do it on my own, but it's not always true for me. So some of the skills I learned during this presentation that I'll use in future projects is now, we had a visiting author named Steve Schenken, and this one day he told us to all come down to the carpet. And so he said, today I'm going to talk to you about writing. And so I was really happy because it wasn't exactly try time, but it definitely weaved into my try time because other kids were just talking about sports, some kids were talking about illnesses and how to cure them, but because I chose writing, I definitely listened up when he spoke of this. So here's a little note I have on the very first picture. It's called Steve's storyboard. And so this is a storyboard that he made up or that he uses sometimes to plan his stories. He's the author of Bomb, I believe, and I believe he said that he used this storyboard to set up the story. So it goes like this. Every day, blah, 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 something happened. Every day, people were writing books, for an example. One day, blah, 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 every day until someone stopped writing books, for an example. And because of that, this happened, this person was angry, and because of that, this happened, this person decided to take action. Until finally, they all decided to, for an example, start writing books again, and they lived happily ever after. I like this because although it's not specifically for poetry, I think to some degree I can also use it in poetry because a poetry is not necessarily a way of describing things, explaining feelings. It can also be a way of telling a story, and that's something I definitely wanted to remember when I was writing. This was something Mr. Buxton taught us. It was how to do a table that kept an overview of your cards. Now I wanted to include this because this really helped me get an overview and help with my productivity. As I mentioned before on my creativity slide, I included it because it gave me an overview of the slides I had, and it was really helpful to me, and I'll definitely be sure to use this in the future. Now this is another picture of the list I had at the very start in my presentation part 1 video. This I found was quite interesting because it wasn't exactly a skill, but it was Mr. Buxton showing us how to write a good, or how to present a good timeline presentation. Now, in your timeline presentation, you want to have a history, like well, I call it what you call it, timeline presentation, because it's showing the journey. It's showing the journey you went through and where you started and how you reached your goal and the history you had. And you can see that right here. History, backstory, the challenges, the things, the advice you got, and the questions you were trying to answer yourself when going on this journey. And finally also where it ended up, like how you reached your goal and what happened when you reached your goal. So this wasn't actually a mandatory slide, but I felt it was important to include it because I wanted to share with you some of the advice I got during my TriTime experience and how I applied it. So this is one thing that I definitely thought was noteworthy that I never really thought of before this was Mr. Schenken, or Steve Schenken, said, "Tell them what went wrong." He spoke about when he was writing his stories with his editor. This one time, he had a scene or an entire chapter from his story that he really, really wanted to include, and he was quite proud of it because he'd written it with good word choice, of course, blah, blah, blah. But the editor said, "You know, Steve, people aren't going to read your book if they include it." And so he said, "I want to include this scene. I'm not going to have it in my book, but I'm going to keep it at home. I'm going to keep the note that has the ideas of it. I might append it to the end of my book or add it to the end of my book." I'm not quite sure if that was the correct word choice. And I definitely use this in my presentation. I think it's just as important to speak of the things that went right in your timeline presentation as to speak of the things that went wrong and how you overcame them. And this is definitely something I wanted to remember. Mr. Buxton said on the first or second week when we were doing research, the amount of research you get is the amount of success you'll get. And now this is definitely something I wanted to remember, because I had to do a lot of research and I had to do a lot of analyzation of the characteristics of the good poets to myself also become a good poet, because if I don't reflect on the world around me, I won't write good stuff for the world around me. And so that was definitely something I wanted to remember. And so when Mr. Schenken said, tell them what went wrong, I applied it by writing down every single mistake. Now, I don't have a picture of it, but I have an entire page of notes where I wrote down all my regrets, all my challenges. You'll see that on my earlier slides. And some of the problems I had. And that was something I was really glad I did. So here's my works cited. I wasn't quite sure if I had to read to you down the works cited, but I'll just briefly explain it. On about 20% of these links are all websites from teachers, from publishing websites, and this is where kids can go in and like a story or a poem that they've read. And so for me, this wasn't only to read the stories and learn what the poets had did, but also to analyze the characteristics of those super popular poems. And as I spoke of before, I was going to apply it to my piece so that my poems and pieces could be more readable. I included this, another website I had was how to improve your poetry skills. And this is a terrible website. Now don't be alarmed. I included this because, as I mentioned before, Steve Schenken said, tell them what you did wrong. And this was during the time period when I was struggling with finding the right research. I wanted to include this because this is a really dumb website. At the time, I didn't know what I was trying to do. I just wanted to write good poetry, and I just wanted people to be impressed by the writing I'd done. And so I went online and I googled blah blah blah, how do I write good poetry? And this is really bad because it's breaking it down for you factually. And this reminds me all of a sudden of a quote from a movie. We don't write poetry because it's cute. We write poetry because we are members of the human race, and because we have passion, and because we love. I'm not sure those are the exact words, but I just thought it was a terrible idea to break down poetry into factual and syllabic and blah, 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 blah. And this is how to write stuff that people want to read. It was terrible for me. And I read through it and I was like, oh no, this is bad. But I got to keep it because I think it was important to show where I went wrong. And so after these 3 weeks, I decided it was time to take action. I wanted to do something that was not only changing my world, but also changing the worlds of the people around me. Not necessarily the whole world. I'm not about to go save the world. I'm not saying it's not possible, but that wasn't what I set out to do. So I decided, and I asked myself, what were my options? How do I apply all these poems I've written and share them with the people around me so that they can be read? And so right now I'm working on printing a little booklet that has all the poems that I've written back in time, because I wanted this to not only be a collection of poems that I've currently written, but I also wanted people to be able to go through, and I'll write the dates of when I wrote them, to go through and look on the journey I went through with my poetry writing skills. Now you'll notice in the start, I even have poems from when I was, 9 or 10, because I usually keep them because I'm such a big fan of the literature. But I was going to include them because I wanted people to see the journey of literature I went on. I wanted them to see the transitions I made, or, the voltas I made, how I got better, how I went through bad periods, how I improved it, what I did wrong. I wanted it all to be a part of just one big piece where people could not only read my poetry, but also through that see what I'd done in my life and kind of how I've changed in my writing. Anyway, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed my TriTime presentation, and I hope you have a nice day. Thank you for listening.